It is late 1943, somewhere in the cold, unforgiving skies over Germany. And Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson is breaking the laws of nature. He is also breaking every rule of conventional air combat ever written. His aircraft, a Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, is not engaged in the elegant, swirling dogfight that pilots dream of. Instead, he is a man strapped to a 7-ton anvil, pointing its nose straight at the earth and accelerating through a scream of tortured metal and shearing wind. Below him, the patchwork of German fields is rushing up not as a landscape, but as an impending, final impact. His airspeed indicator is clawing its way past 450, then 500 miles per hour, deep into a realm pilots called the compressibility zone, a place where the air itself could feel like a solid wall, where controls could freeze, and where a wing could simply tear itself from the fuselage. This was not an escape. This was a hunt. From the cockpit of his nimble Focke-Wulf 190, the German ace below watches this unfold with a sense of detached disbelief. He has seen the American Jug, a nickname spat out with contempt, short for juggernaut, lumbering in the distance. He had seen it as an easy kill, a fat, slow target, ripe for the picking. American bombers were vulnerable, but their escorts? These flying milk bottles were considered a joke among the seasoned veterans of the Luftwaffe. They couldn't turn, they couldn't climb, and they certainly couldn't fight in the traditional sense. So when the P-47 pilot didn't bank or weave or try to outmaneuver him, but instead nosed over into a seemingly suicidal plunge, the German pilot likely felt a flash of arrogant pity. Was this young American terrified? Had his nerve broken? Or was he simply a fool, choosing a quick, gravity-assisted death over a drawn-out execution by 20mm cannon? The thought that this dive was, in fact, an attack, a calculated, brutally effective offensive maneuver, was so alien, so contrary to the physics of aerial warfare, that it bordered on the insane. This single moment encapsulates the story of the P-47 Thunderbolt, an aircraft born from controversy and forged in defiance. It is not just a story of a machine, but a story of how a group of American pilots, initially ridiculed by their allies and underestimated by their enemies, had to unlearn everything they knew about survival. They were forced to confront an enemy far more relentless than the Luftwaffe, the very laws of physics, and their own primal, screaming instincts. To win, they had to embrace what looked like certain death. They had to fly straight down. Their reward for this madness? An almost unbelievable 1:9-to-1 kill ratio in certain engagements, a record that would help shatter the backbone of German air defense. But this triumph was not inevitable. It was earned through terror, through near-fatal experiments, and through the stubborn vision of a few leaders who saw a weapon where everyone else saw a liability. At the heart of this transformation was a young man like Robert Johnson, who carried more than just the weight of his aircraft into the sky. He carried the weight of a promise. Before he had left his home in Lawton, Oklahoma, his father, a stern, practical man, had pulled him aside. He hadn't spoken of glory, or medals, or the duty to country. He had looked his son in the eye and given him a single, solemn instruction. "Son," he'd said, his voice low and steady, "I don't care if you become an ace. I don't care if you shoot down 100 planes. Don't you try to be a lone hero. Your only job is to learn the rules, fly smart, and come home alive. You promise me that. You be a survivor, not a hero." That promise had become Johnson's mantra, his guiding star in the chaos of war. But now, thousands of feet in the air, that promise felt like a curse. Every fiber of his being, every lesson from flight school, screamed that what he was doing was the exact opposite of flying smart. It was reckless. It was suicide. The G-forces were crushing him into his seat, draining the blood from his head, threatening to pull a gray veil of unconsciousness over his eyes. Survival meant escape, it meant evasion, it meant using agility to stay alive. Yet here he was, willingly plummeting in a machine. Pilots had cursed as being built by the pound, a behemoth that could dive through a brick wall and come out the other side, but couldn't dance. The brutal irony was that, in order to keep his promise to his father to survive, he first had to trust a tactic that felt like a betrayal of that very promise. He had to trust that in this new, vertical battlefield, the one who was willing to fall fastest was the one who would live to fly another day. This is not a story about the greatest fighter plane of World War II. It is the story of the most misunderstood. It's the story of how a cursed, overweight iron pig was transformed into the ultimate instrument of aerial dominance. It is a lesson in how innovation is often born from desperation, and how the greatest strengths can lie hidden within what appear to be fatal flaws. The journey to that realization was not paved with engineering diagrams and tactical briefings alone. It was paved with the harrowing, near-death experiences of test pilots who discovered a deadly secret locked within the Thunderbolt's design. A secret that could either kill you or make you invincible. The question facing every P-47 pilot, including Robert Johnson, was whether they had the discipline, the courage, and the faith to tell the difference before the ground decided for them. To understand the machine that Robert Johnson was entrusting his life to, you first have to understand the mind of the man who created it. Alexander Kartveli was not just an aircraft designer. He was a dreamer, an artist whose medium was aluminum and steel. A Georgian immigrant who had fled the Bolshevik Revolution, he carried with him a distinctly European education, but had embraced a purely American philosophy. Bigger is better, and power solves all problems. When the U.S. Army Air Corps issued a requirement for a new high-altitude interceptor, a fighter that could climb to the stratosphere to meet incoming enemy bombers, Kartveli didn't start with a sleek, agile airframe. He started with an engine. But it wasn't just any engine. It was the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, a supercharged, 18-cylinder radial beast that was, at the time, the most powerful aviation engine on the planet. It was a masterpiece of mechanical engineering, a contained explosion generating over 2,000 horsepower, a figure that was almost unthinkable for a single-engine fighter in that era. Kartveli's vision was audacious and almost heretical. He didn't design a fighter plane and then fit an engine into it. He took the most powerful engine in the world and decided to build a fighter plane around it. Every other consideration, agility, weight, even conventional aesthetics, was secondary. The R2800 was the heart, the soul, and the entire reason for the P-47's existence. But raw power at sea level was useless for the mission required. The real challenge was making that power available at 30,000 or 40,000 feet, where the air is thin and unforgiving, where an unassisted engine would gasp for oxygen and lose more than half its strength. This is where Kartveli's genius truly shone. He integrated a complex and massive General Electric turbo supercharger system, a device that was more commonly found on multi-engine heavy bombers. Imagine a blacksmith's bellows, but instead of being pumped by hand, it's spun by the engine's own superheated exhaust gases at over 20,000 revolutions per minute. This spinning turbine would cram pressurized air into the engine, allowing it to breathe freely and generate maximum power in the near vacuum of the upper atmosphere. The problem was its size. The entire system, the turbine, the intercoolers to cool the compressed air, and the vast network of ducting was enormous. To make it fit, Kartveli had to run the ducts from the engine in the nose, down along the belly of the aircraft, to the turbocharger unit located in the tail, and then all the way back to the engine. This complex plumbing dictated the P-47's entire shape. It's why the fuselage was so deep and barrel-chested, why it looked less like a graceful falcon and more like a charging bull. It's why the cockpit was perched so high, giving the pilot the unnerving sensation of riding on top of a flying locomotive. And it's why the final aircraft, fully loaded with fuel, and its 8 50-caliber machine guns, tipped the scales at over 15,000 pounds. It was, quite literally, twice the weight of a Supermarine Spitfire and nearly double that of the German Bf 109 it was expected to fight. When the first P-47 seconds arrived in England in late 1942, the reception from the battle-hardened Royal Air Force pilots was not just skeptical, it was openly mocking. They took one look at the colossal fighter and nicknamed it the Jug. The official story is that it was short for Juggernaut. The unofficial, and more likely, story is that it was because it looked like a common, ugly 7-ton milk jug. They joked that a P-47 pilot could run around inside the fuselage to evade enemy fire. They watched its ponderous takeoff runs, its sluggish climb rate at lower altitudes, and its utter inability to turn with their nimble Spitfires, and they shook their heads in dismay. By every known metric of aerial combat, the P-47 was a disaster. It was a pilot's nightmare, a flying brick that violated the sacred trinity of fighter design: climb, turn, and run. This skepticism was not just a matter of professional pride. It was rooted in a genuine life-or-death crisis. By 1943, the American strategic bombing campaign against Germany was on the verge of collapse. B-17, Flying Fortresses, and B-24 Liberators were being sent on long, unescorted missions deep into enemy territory, and they were being systematically annihilated. Losses were catastrophic, with crews having a lower chance of completing a 25-mission tour than a soldier had of surviving the trenches of World War I. The political and military pressure was immense. If the bombers couldn't be protected, the entire strategy for crippling Germany's war machine from the air would fail. The P-38 Lightning, with its twin engines, had range but was plagued by engine troubles in the cold European air. The P-51 Mustang, the eventual savior, was still months away from being available in large numbers with its definitive Merlin engine. The flawed, overweight, and unloved P-47 Thunderbolt was, for a terrifying moment in history, the only hope. It was a gamble on an epic scale. A bet that Kartvel's radical focus on power and high-altitude performance could somehow compensate for its glaring, seemingly fatal deficiencies in agility. But the pilots tasked with flying this beast faced a more immediate problem than scorn from their allies or the strategic stakes of the war. They were discovering that the Jug was not just awkward, it was treacherous. The engineers had designed a machine that could, theoretically, operate at incredible speeds and altitudes. But in the real world, as test pilots pushed the aircraft to its limits, they stumbled upon a terrifying secret locked deep within its design. At speeds approaching the sound barrier, something went horribly wrong. The air flowing over the thick wings would begin to separate, creating shock waves that rendered the flight controls useless. The stick would freeze solid in the pilot's hand, or conversely, it would thrash about with such violence it could break his wrist. The plane would enter an uncontrollable, terrifying dive, its nose dropping towards the earth with a will of its own. This was the dark side of Kartvel's vision, a phenomenon known as compressibility. It was a deadly trap, a physical barrier that seemed to declare that the P-47's greatest theoretical strength, its phenomenal diving speed, was an unusable, suicidal party trick. Was this an unsolvable design flaw, or was it, just perhaps, a locked door to which someone, somehow, had to find the key before it killed them all? The key to unlocking the P-47's deadly secret would not be found in an engineering lab or on a drafting table. It would be forged in terror, thousands of feet in the sky, by two test pilots who flew closer to the edge of death than nearly any combat pilot ever would. In the autumn of 1942, Lieutenants Harold Comstock and Roger Dyer were tasked with a chillingly simple mission: find the Thunderbolt's breaking point. They were to push the aircraft to its absolute limits, specifically in a dive, to see how fast it could truly go. The numbers they were chasing were abstract, lines on a graph in a flight manual. The reality was a visceral, life-or-death battle against the forces of nature. In one of these test flights, Comstock nosed his P-47 over from 35,000 feet. The aircraft responded exactly as Kartveli had intended. Gravity took hold, and the Thunderbolt, with its immense weight and clean aerodynamics, began to accelerate at a breathtaking rate. 500 miles per hour came and went. Then, 600. The airframe started to shudder, a low-frequency vibration that hummed through the pilot's very bones. As the needle on his indicated airspeed indicator climbed past 700 miles per hour, a speed no single-engine propeller plane had ever officially reached, the shuddering escalated into a violent buffeting. Suddenly, it happened. Compressibility. The airflow over the wings went supersonic, creating shockwaves that slammed into the tail and elevators. His controls, which should have been responsive, turned to concrete. The stick was frozen solid. He was a passenger in a 7-ton bullet aimed at the heart of Long Island. Panic is the natural human response. The instinct is to fight, to pull back on the stick with all your might, to wrestle the machine back into submission. Comstock did just that, bracing his feet against the instrument panel and heaving with every ounce of strength he possessed. The stick wouldn't budge. The ground was screaming toward him. In those desperate final seconds, with death not just possible but seemingly inevitable, he did something that went against every instinct. He stopped pulling. Remembering an obscure piece of flight theory, he reached for the elevator trim tab, a small wheel designed for fine-tuning control pressures. He cranked it back, manually adjusting the small surface on the elevator itself. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, miraculously, the nose began to lift. As the plane descended into the thicker, denser air of lower altitudes, the shock waves dissipated and control returned. He had survived, pulling out of the dive with only a few thousand feet to spare. Dayar, in a separate flight, experienced the same terrifying phenomenon, and, through a similar process of desperate innovation, also found the trim tab solution. They had not just cheated death, they had returned with a priceless piece of intelligence. They had discovered that the demon of compressibility could, in fact, be tamed. The recovery procedure was terrifying and counterintuitive. You had to trust a small wheel instead of the main stick, but it was repeatable. They had mapped the very edge of the abyss. This report, filled with technical data about G-forces and Mach numbers, eventually landed on the desk of Colonel Hubert Hub Zemke, the commander of the 56th Fighter Group, the first unit to take the P-47 into combat in Europe. Zemke was a different breed of leader. He was not an impulsive daredevil. He was a cold, calculating strategist, a chess player in a world of checkers. He read the test pilot's harrowing accounts not as a warning, but as an instruction manual. He saw what everyone else had missed. The problem wasn't that the P-47 entered an uncontrollable dive. The revelation was that it could enter a dive no other fighter in the world could follow and still recover. Zemke connected the dots. He looked at the P-47's supposed weaknesses, its immense weight, its sluggishness in a turn, its poor climb rate at low altitude. Then he looked at its strengths, the indestructible airframe, the unparalleled horsepower of the R-2800 at high altitude, and now, this newly discovered, phenomenal diving speed. A lesser commander would have tried to find ways to minimize the weaknesses, to force the P-47 to fight like a Spitfire. Zemke made a revolutionary decision. He would ignore the weaknesses entirely. In fact, he would make them irrelevant. He laid down a new doctrine, a set of rules so radical it bordered on heresy. His pilots, young men full of aggressive spirit and eager to prove their worth, were forbidden from engaging in dogfights. They were explicitly ordered not to mix it up with the nimble German fighters in turning battles they were guaranteed to lose. They were not to chase enemy planes in a climb. Their job was to do one thing, and one thing only: exploit the vertical. Use the altitude your engine gives you, he drilled into them. It is your lifeblood. It is potential energy. His new combat philosophy was brutally simple. You start high, you wait, you identify your target, and then you push the nose over and let gravity and 2,000 horsepower do the rest. You become the anvil. Comstock and Dayar had so narrowly avoided being crushed by, you dive straight down, attack in a single high-speed pass, and then use the colossal energy from that dive to zoom back up to the safety of high altitude, leaving the enemy pilot staring at an empty patch of sky, wondering what just hit him. It was a tactic later dubbed boom and zoom, and it was the perfect asymmetric warfare for the P-47. It turned physics itself into their primary weapon. But a theory written on a chalkboard is one thing. Convincing a cockpit full of scared, adrenaline-fueled young men to trust that theory when their lives were on the line was another challenge entirely. They were being asked to place their faith not in their own skill as dogfighters, but in a commander's strange new religion of gravity and discipline. Would they follow these orders when every instinct screamed for them to turn and fight? Hub Zemke's new religion of vertical warfare was not built on faith alone. It was forged in a crucible of relentless, brutal training. Back at their base in England, he drilled his pilots with a fanatical intensity. The rules were simple, elegant, and completely unnatural. Eyes up, heads on a swivel. His voice would crackle over the radio during mock combat. Altitude is your bank account. Don't spend it recklessly. Every training sortie was a sermon on the same core principles. Climb together, stay together, dive together, shoot, and then, most critically, resist the siren song of the dogfight. After your pass, you were to convert your speed back into altitude, rejoining the formation to become a threat once again. It was a cold, efficient, almost industrial approach to aerial combat, stripping it of its romantic notions of individual duels and chivalrous jousts. For young, aggressive pilots like Robert S. Johnson, this was a difficult pill to swallow. Like every fighter pilot, he had been raised on the legends of World War I aces like Eddie Rickenbacker, lone wolves, who charged into the fray, their skill and courage winning the day. They had been trained to turn, to outmaneuver, to get on an enemy's tail and stay there until he was a plume of smoke. Zemke's doctrine felt like a leash. It felt passive. It demanded a level of trust and patience that ran counter to the very DNA of a fighter pilot. The internal conflict was immense. The desire for personal glory, for that first confirmed kill that would mark you as a true warrior, was a powerful, intoxicating drug. To deny that instinct, to let an enemy escape because chasing him would break formation or drag you into a low-altitude brawl, felt like a form of cowardice. This simmering conflict between personal ambition and group discipline came to a head on one of Johnson's earliest combat missions. Flying high above the European coast, the 56th Fighter Group spotted a flight of German foe 190 seconds far below. The trap was set. The P-47 seconds peeled off, one by one, into their characteristic thunderous dives. Johnson picked his target, the crosshairs of his gun sight centering on the black cross of the Luftwaffe fighter. He followed the procedure, his Thunderbolt screaming downwards, the world a blur of green and grey. He squeezed the trigger, and the 8.50 caliber guns erupted in a deafening roar, a torrent of lead that ripped into the German aircraft. It was a perfect kill. Smoke poured from the F-Bluff 190 as it tumbled out of the sky. But in that moment of triumphant adrenaline, Johnson made a critical mistake. Instead of immediately using his speed to climb back to the safety of his squadron, he lingered. He followed the crippled plane down, watching it fall, confirming his victory with his own eyes. It was a rookie error, born of ego and excitement. By the time he looked up, his squadron was gone, vanished back into the high-altitude sanctuary they had come from. He was alone, utterly and completely alone, low and slow over enemy territory. For the next 10 minutes, Johnson experienced the purest form of terror as German fighters swarmed him. He survived not through skill, but through sheer, dumb luck, his P-47 absorbing a terrifying amount of punishment as he clawed his way back towards England. When he landed, shaking but alive, he expected a hero's welcome for his first kill. Instead, he was met by a stone-faced Hub Zemke. In front of the entire squadron, assembled for the debrief, Zemke didn't congratulate him. He eviscerated him. "You got one." Zemke's voice was low, but it cut through the room like a razor. "And in doing so, you broke the single most important rule we have. You abandoned your wingman. You abandoned your element. You abandoned the group. He walked closer to Johnson, his eyes boring into the young pilot. That kill is worthless. If you had been shot down, your loss would have cost us far more than that German plane was worth. We are not a collection of individuals out here trying to rack up a score. We are a team. We fight as a team. We win as a team. And we survive as a team. Your ego is not part of the equation. The public humiliation was crushing. But as Johnson stood there, shame burning in his cheeks, another voice echoed in his mind, the quiet, steady voice of his father back in Oklahoma. Don't you try to be a lone hero. Your only job is to come home alive. In that moment, the two lessons, one from his father and one from his commander, fused into a single, undeniable truth. Zemke wasn't just teaching tactics, he was teaching survival on a larger scale. The promise to his father wasn't just about his own life. It was an implicit promise to the men flying beside him. To be a survivor, he had to ensure his teammates survived as well. The lone wolf dies. The pack endures. From that day forward, Robert Johnson became a convert, a true believer in the Church of Hub Zemke. The lesson had been learned, paid for in terror and shame. But the real test was yet to come. It was one thing to follow the rules during drills over the green fields of England. It was another thing entirely to maintain that iron discipline in the heart of a massive, chaotic air battle, with hundreds of planes swirling, with cannon shells ripping past your canopy, and with the primal, instinctual scream in your head, telling you to turn and fight. The 56th Fighter Group's new, radical doctrine was about to be thrown into the crucible of one of the largest and most ferocious air battles of the war. Their enemy would not just be the skilled pilots of the Luftwaffe. Their greatest enemy would be the fear and the instinct for self-preservation raging within their own cockpits. The ultimate test of Hub Zemke's radical theories arrived on August 17, 1943. The mission was codenamed Operation Juggler, but history would remember it by the names of its targets, Schweinfurt and Regensburg. This was not just another bombing run. It was the most ambitious and perilous aerial assault ever attempted by the American 8th Air Force. The plan was audacious. A massive formation of 376 B-17 bombers would strike deep into the heart of Germany, targeting the critical ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt and the Messerschmitt aircraft plant in Regensburg. These targets were so vital that the Luftwaffe was expected to throw every fighter it had into the sky to defend them. For the bomber crews, it was a near-suicidal journey into the hornet's nest. For the 56th Fighter Group, it was the final exam for their doctrine of discipline and diving attacks. As the vast armada of bombers crossed into enemy airspace, the sky erupted. The German response was exactly as ferocious as predicted. Hundreds of Bf, 109 seconds, and Flaw, 190 seconds, many flown by the most experienced aces in the Luftwaffe, rose to meet them. They came in waves, attacking the lumbering bombers with a savage fury. This was the moment of truth. A traditional fighter escort would have plunged into the melee, scattering to engage the attackers in a swirling, chaotic dogfight. This is precisely what the German commanders anticipated. They wanted the American escorts to break formation, to be lured down into turning fights where their heavier planes would be at a fatal disadvantage. But the 56th did not take the bait. Adhering to Zemke's ironclad rules, they held their position high above the bomber stream, a silent, menacing presence glinting in the sun. They watched, they waited, and they chose their moments with chilling precision. Then, they dove. It was not a battle. It was a series of executions. One after another, the P-47 seconds would tip over into their thunderous plunges, accelerating to speeds the German fighters simply could not match. They screamed through the enemy formations, firing devastating bursts from their 8 guns, and were gone before the Luftwaffe pilots even knew what had hit them. They did not linger. They did not turn. They used their immense kinetic energy to zoom back up to the stratosphere, rearm their metaphorical crossbow, and prepare for another strike. For the German pilots, it was a terrifying and bewildering experience. They were fighting ghosts. They would line up for an attack on a B-17, only to have their wingman disintegrate in a flash of orange flame from an unseen attacker. In the chaos of that day, one of the most significant casualties for the Luftwaffe was believed to have been Major Wilhelm Ferdinand Galland, a decorated ace and the brother of the legendary general of fighters, Adolf Galland. While the exact details of his demise remain debated by historians, his loss was a profound shock to the German High Command. He wasn't outflown or outmaneuvered in a classic duel. He was, according to reports, simply erased from the sky by a diving thunderbolt. A victim of a new and brutal form of physics-based warfare they had no answer for. The 56th proved the doctrine worked, but it was another, more personal event that transformed their tactical confidence into an unshakable, almost mythical faith. The story belonged to Robert Johnson, and it had unfolded a few weeks prior, on June 26th. During a mission, he was jumped by an FW-190 that got the better of him. His P-47 was savaged. Cannon shells tore through his wings, ripped open his fuselage, and shattered his canopy. One 20mm shell exploded behind his instrument panel, sending shrapnel into his legs and setting the cockpit ablaze with hydraulic fluid. Blinded, wounded, and flying a plane that was, by all rights, a falling coffin, Johnson's training took over. He put the jug into the one maneuver he knew the enemy couldn't follow, a dive. He plummeted towards the earth, the fire in his cockpit mercifully extinguishing in the violent rush of air. He leveled out just above the ground and limped for home. He was a sitting duck. Another German pilot eventually caught up to him, lining up for the final, easy kill. The German fired, and Johnson's plane shuddered under the impacts, but stubbornly, it kept flying. The German fired again, and again. The Thunderbolt absorbed the punishment like a heavyweight boxer taking body blows. Finally, the German pilot, his ammunition apparently exhausted, did something extraordinary. He pulled up alongside Johnson's tattered aircraft, looked across the gap, gave a slow, respectful salute, and then peeled away, leaving him to his fate. Johnson, against all odds, made it back to his base. The ground crew stopped counting at 200 holes from bullets and cannon shells. The main spar of one wing was nearly severed. The plane was a wreck, destined for the scrapyard, but its pilot was alive. That story became a legend. It spread through the 56th Fighter Group and then to every P-47 unit in Europe, not as a cautionary tale, but as a gospel. It was the birth of the psychological shield. The pilots now knew that the machine beneath them was not just a weapon. It was a guardian. It could absorb unimaginable damage and still bring them home. This knowledge was profoundly liberating. It removed the deep-seated fear that a single mistake or a lucky shot would be fatal. It emboldened them to push their dives faster, to fly closer to the edge, and to trust Zemke's tactics with an almost religious fervor. Now, when they pointed the nose of their 7-ton jugs straight at the ground, they weren't just following orders. They were armored with the unshakable belief that even if they flew through hell itself, their iron pig would carry them back. The Luftwaffe had just lost their greatest psychological advantage, the fear in the American cockpit. The psychological shield that protected the American pilots had a terrifying inverse effect on their opponents. For the German Luftwaffe, the P-47 Thunderbolt transformed from a joke into a demon. The entire dynamic of air combat over Europe began to shift. Before the 56th Fighter Group perfected their tactics, the German pilots were the hunters. They were the masters of their domain, confident in their superior machines and years of combat experience. They dictated the terms of engagement. Now, they were the prey. They found themselves constantly craning their necks, looking up into the blinding glare of the sun, searching for the tiny, glinting specks that could materialize into 7-ton thunderbolts of death in a matter of seconds. In response, the Luftwaffe was forced to adapt, but their adaptations were born of desperation, not innovation. Experienced German aces tried to devise counter-tactics. They knew that if they could lure a P-47 into a turning fight, especially at low altitude, the American pilot was as good as dead. They would try to bait them, presenting what looked like an easy target, hoping to draw a Thunderbolt down from its high-altitude perch into a swirling dogfight on their terms. On other occasions, when attacked, German formations would pull into a defensive circle, or Luftwaffe, where each plane covered the tail of the one in front, creating a deadly carousel of crisscrossing fire for anyone trying to attack from the side. But Hub Zemke and his disciplined pilots rarely fell for these traps. They stuck to their doctrine with a religious fanaticism. They refused to be baited. They would simply watch the defensive circles from above, like patient vultures, waiting for a single German pilot to make a mistake, to break formation, or to head for home. Then, they would dive. This refusal to engage on traditional terms was more than just a tactical problem for the Germans. It was a profound psychological blow. It felt unfair. It felt dishonorable. They were being denied the warrior's duel they had been trained for. In its place was a cold, systematic process of attrition, executed from a position of overwhelming energy advantage. The sound of the P-47's turbo supercharger, a high-pitched whine that some pilots likened to an Indian war whoop, became a herald of impending doom. The culmination of this newfound dominance came in the last week of February 1944. The operation was codenamed Argument, but it would go down in history as Big Week. It was a massive, coordinated, all-out assault on the German aircraft industry, with over 1,000 heavy bombers, escorted by nearly 1,000 fighters, striking targets across the Reich in a relentless, round-the-clock campaign. For the P-47 pilots, this was the moment their training, discipline, and psychological armor were put to the ultimate test on a scale never before seen. The sky over Germany was no longer a battlefield. It was an industrial-scale abattoir. During Big Week, the Thunderbolt pilots were unleashed, flying in support of the bombers. Their primary mission was to sweep the skies of any and all German resistance, and they did so with a terrifying efficiency. This is where the almost mythical kill ratios, like 1:9 were reportedly achieved. Squadrons of P-47 seconds would descend upon German fighter formations, shattering them in a single pass. Men like Robert Johnson and Francis Gaby Gabreski, now seasoned veterans and masters of the diving attack, racked up victory after victory. They were no longer just defending the bombers, they were actively hunting the Luftwaffe to extinction. For the German dayfighter force, Big Week was a catastrophe from which it would never truly recover. They lost hundreds of aircraft, but more devastatingly, they lost hundreds of their most experienced and irreplaceable pilots. The veteran aces were being whittled down, replaced by hastily trained teenagers who were sent up as little more than cannon fodder against the American onslaught. We can only imagine the terror from the other side of the cockpit. Famed German ace Günther Rall, one of the few to survive the war, spoke of the psychological weight of fighting against the Americans' overwhelming numbers and industrial might. He described the feeling of being a single firefighter trying to put out a forest fire. For every plane they shot down, 10 more seemed to appear on the horizon. Now, added to this numerical superiority, was a terrifying tactical supremacy. Young German pilots, climbing to intercept the bomber streams, would have heard the panicked calls over their radios. Achtung Indianer! Warning Indians! The code for P-47 seconds diving from above. They would have looked up to see not planes, but silver streaks, growing larger at an impossible speed, the air screaming around them. There was often no time to react, no chance to evade. One moment you were a hunter, the next you were a statistic. This constant, vertical threat shattered morale and instilled a deep-seated dread. The war in the sky was no longer a contest of skill. For the Luftwaffe, it had become a simple, brutal matter of survival. The success of the P-47 and its boom and zoom tactics had effectively broken the back of the Luftwaffe's dayfighter defense. It cleared the way for the P-51 Mustang to roam at will, and it ensured the American bombers could continue their relentless campaign, crippling Germany's ability to wage war. the victory was total. But it also posed a deeper, more fundamental question about the nature of courage in this new form of warfare. Was the bravery of a P-47 pilot the same as that of a knight charging into battle, or did it require something different? The pilots were not relying on frantic, instinctual maneuvering. They were relying on a cold, calculated trust in physics. They had to possess a unique form of mental fortitude, a willingness to repeatedly commit to a maneuver that felt, looked, and sounded like suicide, all while suppressing the primal scream inside their own heads that urged them to pull back. Had the P-47, an awkward giant, born of one man's engineering dream, not only changed the course of the air war, but also redefined the very soul of the fighter pilot. When the guns of World War II finally fell silent, the final tally for the P-47 Thunderbolt and its pioneering pilots was staggering. The 56th Fighter Group, Hub Zemke's original apostles of the diving attack, finished the war with more enemy aircraft destroyed than any other group in the 8th Air Force. Men like Francis Gabreski and Robert S. Johnson, who had started the war as skeptics of the awkward giant, ended it as two of America's top-scoring aces in the European theater. The Jug, the aircraft that had been mocked, cursed, and underestimated, had carved out a legacy of dominance. But the true legacy of the P-47 was not written in kill counts or medal citations. It was written in the fundamental laws of physics, and it would change the way every fighter pilot would be trained for generations to come. The impromptu, life-or-death tactics developed by Zemke and his pilots were eventually formalized into what is now known as energy maneuverability theory, or EM theory. It's a complex name for a simple, brutal truth that the 56th had discovered. In a sky full of enemies, the pilot who manages his energy best wins. Energy exists in two basic forms: potential energy, which is altitude, and kinetic energy, which is airspeed. The P-47, with its immense weight and powerful high-altitude engine, was the perfect instrument for proving this theory. Its weight, a fatal flaw in a low-speed turning fight, became a tremendous asset in converting potential energy into kinetic energy. It could dive like a falling stone. The turbo supercharger, Cart Valley's masterstroke, allowed it to build up a massive bank account of potential energy by climbing to altitudes where its opponents suffocated. The combat doctrine of boom and zoom was simply EM theory put into lethal practice. Make a deposit into your energy account by climbing. Then write a check your enemy can't cash by diving. This principle was so fundamental that it transcended technology. The era of propeller-driven fighters gave way to the age of the jet. But the laws of physics remained unchanged. The proof came less than a decade later, in the cold skies over Korea. One of America's top aces in that new war, flying the sleek, swept-wing F-86 Sabre against the nimble Russian-built MiG-15, was a familiar name: Francis Gabreski. The F-86, much like the P-47, was heavier and more rugged than its primary adversary. The MiG-15 could outclimb and outturn the Sabre at certain altitudes. Faced with a similar tactical problem, Gabreski and the other veteran pilots of his generation did not have to reinvent the wheel. They reached back into their old playbook. They used the F-86's superior diving speed and energy retention, employing the same boom and zoom tactics they had perfected in their Thunderbolts. The lesson of the Jug had become the core doctrine of a new generation of jet jockeys. Don't fight the enemy's fight. Fight your fight. Looking back, the story of the P-47 unfolds as a powerful lesson on multiple levels. It stands as a testament to technological innovation, not just in creating a powerful machine, but in having the vision to see how its perceived flaws could be its greatest strengths. The weight of the Thunderbolt was not a bug. It was a feature, waiting for the right user manual to be written. This is the very essence of out-of-the-box thinking, challenging the core assumptions of a problem to find a revolutionary solution. It's a story about recognizing that sometimes the most effective way forward is not to turn, but to dive straight down. But beyond the technology, it is a profoundly human story about the conflict between the individual and the collective. Robert Johnson's painful lesson, being publicly shamed for a victory, was the crucible that forged his understanding of a deeper truth. His promise to his father to be a survivor was ultimately fulfilled not through lone wolf heroics, but through an unwavering discipline and a commitment to his team. The survival of the group became paramount. This moral dimension, the shift from a pursuit of personal glory to a dedication to mutual support, is what transformed the 56th from a collection of pilots into an unstoppable fighting force. They learned that true strength wasn't measured by the tally next to one pilot's name, but by the number of pilots who came home at the end of the day. Finally, it is a story about the often overlooked power of psychology in conflict. The legend of Johnson's indestructible plane was as powerful a weapon as any of its 8 machine guns. That psychological shield gave the American pilots a mental edge, a form of courage that was not reckless but calculated. It was the confidence to fly their aircraft to the absolute ragged edge of its performance envelope, knowing they had a better chance of returning than the man in the cockpit across from them. They conquered their own fear, and in doing so, they weaponized the fear of their enemy. The whine of the Thunderbolt's turbo became a sound that broke not just formations, but spirits. So, what was the ultimate source of the P-47 Thunderbolt's victory? Was it the 2,000 horsepower bursting from its 18-cylinder engine, a triumph of American industrial might? Or was it the power of a single, radical idea, an idea that dared to defy every convention of air combat, an idea that trusted the cold, hard logic of physics over the hot-blooded instincts of the pilot? The answer, perhaps, lies in the perfect fusion of the two, a machine built for power and a doctrine built for thinkers. It proved that in the end, the greatest weapon in any war is the human mind's ability to see a completely different way to win. The story of the P-47 Thunderbolt is more than just a fascinating chapter in the history of World War II. It's a timeless parable about perception, innovation, and the courage to defy convention. It teaches us that the greatest limitations we face are often the ones we impose upon ourselves, the rules that we accept without question. The pilots of the 56th Fighter Group were told their plane was a flawed, overweight liability. Conventional wisdom said it couldn't turn, it couldn't climb well, and therefore, it couldn't fight. Had they accepted that reality, the jug would have been relegated to the footnotes of history. But a few visionary leaders like Hub Zemke and disciplined pilots like Robert Johnson chose to see the problem from a different axis entirely. When everyone else was thinking horizontally, in the flat, two-dimensional plane of the dogfight, they started thinking vertically. When everyone else saw weight as a weakness that hindered agility, they recognized it as a strength that stored immense energy. They didn't try to fix the P-47's weaknesses. They built a new game where those weaknesses became irrelevant and its unique strengths became overwhelmingly dominant. They didn't turn when the world told them to turn. They chose to dive straight down. This principle extends far beyond the battlefield. In our careers, our businesses, and even our personal lives, we are constantly confronted by conventional wisdom. We are told, this is how it's always been done. We face problems that seem intractable because we are trying to solve them with the same thinking that everyone else uses. We try to engage in a turning fight against competitors or challenges that are nimbler, faster, or better established. We exhaust ourselves trying to match their strengths, when our own unique, game-changing advantage might be hiding in plain sight, disguised as a flaw. But the lesson of the P-47 teaches us to ask a different set of questions. What is the heavy, awkward asset that you possess, which everyone else overlooks? What is the flaw in your situation that could be flipped into a devastating advantage if you just change the rules of engagement? The P-47's success came from embracing asymmetric strategy, refusing to play the opponent's game, and instead creating a new one. And so, we want to leave you with a challenge. Think about a significant obstacle you are currently facing in your professional or personal life. The conventional approach, the dogfighting solution, probably involves a direct, head-on struggle. But what would happen if you applied the straight-down principle? What would it look like to step back, climb to a higher perspective, and use a unique strength of yours to come at the problem from a completely different and unexpected angle? We want you to share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us, what is a straight-down tactic you have used, or could use, to solve a difficult problem in your field, instead of getting stuck in the conventional turning fight that everyone else is in? Your story, your insight, could be the spark of inspiration that helps someone else see their own P-47 not as a liability, but as the key to their greatest victory. History is filled with these incredible stories, not just of dates and battles, but of profound lessons in human ingenuity, courage, and creative thinking. They show us that the past is not just something to be remembered, it is a blueprint for future success. If you believe that history holds the keys to solving modern challenges, and you want to explore more untold stories of the brave and the brilliant, then please support our channel by hitting the like button, subscribing, and ringing the bell so you never miss an episode. Join our squadron as we continue to dive into the lessons the past has for our present. Thank you for watching.